Today on Cyberwork, I speak with French Caldwell, longtime Gartner Research Fellow and co-founder of the Analyst Syndicate. We talked about the founding of the Analyst Syndicate, as well as the creation of a cyber terrorist simulator game designed for White House staff, and why you shouldn't allocate too much of your security resources guarding your digital garbage. That's all today on Cyberwork. I also want to tell you about Cyberwork Applied, a new series from Cyberwork. Whether you want to learn how cross-site scripting attacks work, set up a man-in-the-middle attack, or get a blow-by-blow recap of the Equifax breach, expert Infosec instructors and industry practitioners will teach these cybersecurity skills and show you how these skills apply to real-world scenarios. And best of all, it is 100% free. So go to infosecinstitute.com/learn or check out the link in the description below and get started with fun hands-on training that keeps the cybersecurity skills you have relevant. That's infosecinstitute.com/learn. And now, on with the show. Welcome to this week's episode of the Cyberwork with Infosec podcast. Each week, we talk with a different industry thought leader about cybersecurity trends, the way those trends affect the work of Infosec professionals, and offer tips for breaking in or moving up the ladder in the cybersecurity industry. French Caldwell is the leading strategist and thought leader in RegTech, including GRC and ESG, cybersecurity, social and digital risk and regulation, and the impact of disruptive technologies on policy and strategy. He's a former Gartner fellow, and following Gartner, he became global head of marketing at a Silicon Valley firm that delivers RegTech solutions for governance, risk, and compliance analytics and reporting. Skilled at the alignment of strategy, communication, technology, processes, analysis, policy, and people to improve business and mission outcomes. Experienced at advising senior executives and corporate directors on disruptive technology, strategic risk management, cybersecurity, and public policy issues. Prior to joining Gartner, French was the director of knowledge services at Arthur Andersen's Office of Government Service, where he worked with strategic clients, including the Central Intelligence Agency, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Department of Defense. French completed a career as a nuclear submarine officer. It's the first one on our show, and he has directed special congressional projects for the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of Defense. Upon retiring from the Navy, he served in the International Liaison and Special Projects Officer for Congressional Commission on Roles and Missions of the Armed Services. French earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Oceanography at the U.S. Naval Academy, Master of Arts in International Studies at Old Dominion University, and a Doctor of Law and Policy at Northeastern University. He earned his command and staff degree at the U.S. Naval War College. He's been a federal executive fellow at the Brookings Institution, an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and an adjunct professor and board member of the Institute for Innovation and Knowledge Management in the Graduate Engineering Management Program at George Washington University. He's also the author of the book Arctic Leverage, Canadian Sovereignty and Security, and has contributed to over 400 research papers and articles. So a while back, we interviewed French's colleague, Diana Kelly, about their work with the Analyst Syndicate. And it's a topic that I wanted to continue with the founder and chief researcher of the group. So we're going to talk about French's time at Gartner Research and also his passion for cybersecurity research as a whole. French, thank you for joining us on Cyberwork.
I'm certainly glad to be here, and thanks for sharing all my biographical information with the audience.
Yeah, sorry for the long bio. I didn't have time to make it shorter, as Mark Twain would have said. So I want to start out with your varied and prestigious careers. You've done everything from time spent working on public policy in a think tank to oceanography on a nuclear sub in the Navy. But in the past 10 years or so, especially, your careers and interests have coalesced largely around IT and cybersecurity. So what is the draw to cybersecurity, since our listeners are mostly cybersecurity professionals? Have you always had an interest in this area, computers and tech, or was that a later in life discovery for you?
It was definitely later in life discovery. When I was at Gartner, I helped to found the risk management and compliance research community. Right. And we set up a whole new team of analysts there. And not knowing where to put us, the powers that be at Gartner said, well, this team, we'll put it in the security group. We could just as well have gone into the business intelligence group.
Right.
There was no right place to put us, and so being in the security group, all of a sudden I found myself surrounded by security analysts, and I learned quite a bit. So it was there. Now, I'd had quite a bit to do with the security analyst before that. I ran, when I got to Gartner, I started up this technology and public policy research community. And one of the questions that a lot of people had back in the early 2000s, this was time frame was 2000, 2001, was, could you actually do a strategic cyber attack, cyber attack on an opponent? Right. And Richard Clark, who was then at the White House, and kind of the cybersecurity czar, he and I were on a Gartner panel together discussing this topic. And afterwards, he asked me, "Is this real? Could it really be done?" And so, with the backing of the White House and Gartner, I approached the Naval War College and had a friend there who was a terrorist expert. And I said, "Well, could terrorists launch a cyber attack on the United States? What would it take?" And he said, "I don't know, but I actually am the dean." He was actually the academic dean at the War College. He said, "I have this whole group here that does nothing but wargaming, so let's wargame it."
Yeah.
So we pulled together. And this by now was 2002, and of course 9/11 had happened. And we pulled together about 100 CIOs, CISOs, subject matter experts, a couple of dozen Gartner analysts, and ran a 3-day war game in which we discovered that yes, you could design a cyber security attack that would be strategic, that would actually shift the balance of power.
Right.
Turn it over, maybe momentarily, but it could be done. And that was in 2002. So that was my real introduction to the security world.
Now, I was going to ask you about that later on. Is that the cyberterrorism war game? I think it's called Digital Pearl Harbor here. Is that
Digital Pearl Harbor? In fact, I have the parking sign for it right outside my office door, pointing to my door, and it says "Parking for Digital Pearl Harbor."
Okay. Oh, wow. That's fantastic. All right. Well, we'll get back to that. I definitely want to ask you more about that because, I think there's a lot to be sort of dug into there. So talking about, angling into cybersecurity from similar things. I noticed, I looked through your bio, and several jobs within your career involved knowledge management, which is, I guess, kind of a new concept to me, but seems to involve sharing of knowledge and information in a way that suggests at least some kinship with information security and access management. Is there a connection between years working in knowledge management and your move toward IT and information security?
Absolutely. And I think it's something that's suddenly becoming more topical. And the reason knowledge management was really about making sure that you're managing that data and information that actually has real business value to the organization. And you're not spending a lot of time managing your trash. All right. So when you look at, security experts, we spend a lot of time guarding our trash. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little more?
Well, it's quite often, since many organizations are very, very poor at information governance. And in other words, deciding what's trash and what's valuable. Right. We have a tendency to go and then try to protect everything. It's relatively the same level of protection, which means that our resources as security teams are pretty spread out. And so with information governance, which I think is important to both knowledge management and to cybersecurity, is we decide really what is valuable. What is valuable to the organization? What is it that is required that we protect it by law? So, such as, privacy laws and so on, they require us to protect, customer information or employee information. So what are those things that we really want to protect? What are those things we have to protect? And do we really need to worry as much about all the other information assets that are out there? Obviously, you're going to put some level of protection around everything, but you don't have to have the same level of protection around everything. Okay.
Yeah. Now, I mean, extending the metaphor of our digital trash, you always hear stories about like, detectives or paparazzi like going through celebrities' trash and finding, So I understand that there's some degree of that, but when we talk about protecting your digital trash, is it just because it's trash because there's not even really realistically much of a way for like hackers to get in through there? Is it sort of that useless, of data, or is it just a priority thing?
Well, ideally, you'd get rid of stuff that you really don't
Right.
need,
Okay.
right? But we never
Yeah.
do.
No.
You know?
No. I'm
So,
finding so much of this job involves just like flipping off switches that have been left on for a decade or whatever.
right. And we have all kinds of assets that are used to manage our trash, not
Hmm.
because we may need some information from some backup tape that was created in 1985. So it's just astounds me as to how much time we spend on both managing and protecting stuff that really has very little value to
Yeah.
the organization.
I mean, if I can sort of suggest something, it sounds. I mean, it's sort of like people just accumulating sort of debris in their house, like because it's just going to take so many decisions to know, like, can we really get rid of that tape spool from 1985, and there's no ramifications whatsoever, and people who already have like, you know, 10 plates of spinning right now are probably thinking, I don't want to think about that right now and stuff like that. So the can just gets kicked down the street for years and years and years. Is that right?
It always does. And but I do think there is this sort of renewed interest in information governance.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
good information governance can make security more effective.
Hmm.
It can also have value to the organization because you determine what has value, what doesn't,
Right.
what is legally required to protect, what is not,
Hmm.
and what should we get rid of, and what do we really need to keep. And once we've done that, then we're going to get a lot more value out of all of our information management efforts. You know.
Yeah, completely agree. Our recent guest Rita Gurvich talked about data governance strategies and information governance, and yeah, definitely go back and check that out. That's a huge topic right now. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about your time working as VP and Gartner Fellow with the research organization Gartner. What were some of the main beats that you covered in your 15 years there? You said you sort of hit a lot of different things, including risk assessment and so forth. But what was your day-to-day work like, and how did you see technical research methodology change in the time that you were there?
Well, I got to Gartner in 1999,
Okay.
and it was once again sort of an accidental thing. I had retired from the Navy a few years before, and had looked and realized that after all my experience in the Navy and having been a federal executive fellow at Brookings and serving on the Secretary of the Navy staff and having made several strategic deterrent patrols on fleet ballistic missile submarines and things like that,
Hmm.
um, I had absolutely no skills for the private sector.
Okay. Yeah.
So I became a
Good that you learned that
consultant.
early.
Yeah,
What's that?
I became a consultant, and
Okay.
worked for Arthur Andersen for a couple of years. I got a call, and that's where I really started learning about knowledge management. They were
Yeah.
very, very good at it, and I took what was being done internally at Arthur Andersen around knowledge management and actually shared that with a number of government clients, and that was really my beat there at
Mm-hmm.
Arthur Andersen. So someone at Arthur Andersen who had been interviewing with Gartner said, "Well, look, I've decided to go work for another firm, but not Gartner." And they asked, "Well, who could we um, think about?" And this colleague of mine gave them my name, and so I ended up at Gartner, and I really liked it. The nice thing about being a Gartner analyst, as opposed to, say, a consultant, is a good consultant needs to spend, a third of their time working on whatever engagement they have, a third of their time managing there are people, if you're, a manager or a partner at a firm, and then a third of your time is spent looking for the next job, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
So at Gartner, I was not managing people, much less having to manage client relationships. And I didn't have to look for the next engagement. It was all a subscription model. Now the whole
Right.
world has caught on to this whole subscription gig these days, haven't
For
they?
sure. Yeah.
Everything's subscription.
Yeah.
We don't own anything.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, we're even subscribing for our infrastructure. Yeah.
Mm.
So it's Gartner was very early in that. And so
Yeah.
with this subscription thing, you actually pay ahead of time too. You don't actually
Right.
have to complete the work
Mm.
before you get paid.
Yeah.
So I thought, man, this is a remarkable business model. What a gig. Until I was got well known, and then I was doing 500 to 1,000, mini client engagements a year. We call them inquiries, or if you go to a conference, it's a one-on-one, 30 minutes of that, which means in your day-to-day job, you're doing lots of these.
Hmm.
So you may be doing half a dozen or more, of these inquiries. And then at conferences, you may be doing 14 101s in a day,
Mm.
with a little bit of a break to get something to, drink. And then
Right.
if you're lucky, you can head out to the toilet,
Yeah.
uh, you know. So it's pretty intense in that regard. And then it leaves you really have to be diligent about trying to find creative ways to carve out time for your research.
Right.
You really do have to do research. You need to, a lot of the research, by the way, is done just by doing the one-on-ones. You learn every possible
There
client
you go.
problem there is. It's not as in-depth as a consultant would go,
Hmm.
but it's lots of people, lots of data points. And so you become pretty good at pattern analysis. If you're a good analyst, you're good at pattern analysis, which then
Okay.
tells you where to go dig deeper.
Yeah.
And do the research. So you are going to spend some time each week doing, the basic research. I read an awful lot as a habit that I had, but got even more intense at Gartner. And even today, I read trade press, um, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Washington Post, New York Times, Guardian, The Economist. And whatever, like I said, whatever trade press comes across my desk.
Right.
So I spend a lot of time reading.
Yeah. I mean, at the when you started in '99, like the internet was certainly around, but it was not as ubiquitous as now. It sounds like you still. I mean, has the ubiquity of the internet as a research tool changed how you research at all, or are you still having to go deep enough to do like deep stack library research and things out in the world like that, or is it a lot more
Well, I
like
used to
at your
love that.
fingertips?
I used to love that. You'd go
Yeah.
into the library and there was a card catalog, and you'd try and
Hmm.
find what you're looking for, and you find a book that looks close to what you're looking for, and then you go do
Know
that
the research
shelf.
librarians on a first name basis, and
Yeah, and then you go to do that shelf search, and
yeah,
all here is all this information that's all. The Dewey Decimal System was a wonderful, wonderful tool. But now we have
yeah,
Google, right?
right,
We
right,
have
right.
Google and Bing and DuckDuckGo and whatever that
Yep.
you want to use. Um, and so I think it's made it easier considerably. I mean, I can get
Yeah.
just about any reference paper I want that's been written, any research document, I can find it on out there one way or another. So
Yeah, and
it's
it seems like
a
it
lot
seems
easier.
like your sort of knowledge detector is good enough that it's easy to sort of sift through and find, the real stuff as well, just from years of doing it.
Yeah, you do. You get better at it. But I tell you, the one thing that's still very important, I think, as an analyst, is having that community,
Mm,
because you can get too narrow in
right.
what you're trying to do. You get too narrow in your research. And I earned my doctorate late in life, and so I know how You just get narrower and narrower the higher your degree goes. And the same thing can happen with your research specialty, where you get narrow, more and more narrow. So having a research community around you is fantastic, and actually, making sure that you are not just in, say, the security research community, but are members of a broader research communities as well. And that way you really have people you can bounce ideas off of, you
Right.
can brainstorm, people who will give you honest peer review of
There you go.
what you've done. That's extraordinarily important to get that, really, because they'll point you in directions that you never would have thought of going on your own. So I think
Right.
that's one of the big values that the analysts at the Analyst Syndicate find, is having that peer community that they can work with.
Yeah. Yeah. That 5-degree course correct that someone else can turn you can make all the difference in terms of getting to where you want to go.
Exactly. Makes a big difference. And sometimes you don't even know where you're going. I had one of
Yeah.
those recently.
Just heading out. Yeah.
Yeah, I had one of those recently on
Okay.
the big it was the big Amazon kerfuffle over the delivery drivers, and putting the essentially putting them under continuous surveillance.
Right.
And of course, everything on their routes is under surveillance, as these cameras that they put in. Not only are they looking at the driver, but they're looking 270 degrees out from the driver, both sides of the van, forward, monitoring everything. And so I was looking at that and sort of being very, very critical of Amazon. And one of my peers said, yeah, but this is all very well and good, but what are the lessons learned here for that other companies can apply? And I thought, yeah, that's good. Unfortunately, that set me back quite a bit. It's a lot easier to just be critical than to think about,
Right.
what are really the recommendations you can make to other companies that are increasing their own employee monitoring. And
Right.
so what did Amazon do right about the way they rolled this out versus what did they do wrong? And I should publish that here sometime soon, but it really set me way back.
Yeah.
So peer review, I really do think is a blessing, but sometimes it's more than a 5-degree course correction.
Yeah. I have to turn the whole ship around.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, the thing that's I think exciting and why I really wanted to talk to you is I noticed that in working from Gartner and then moving on to the Analyst Syndicate, which as I mentioned is a multidimensional platform through which the world's best technology and business analysts publish their research and recommendations. And it feels to me like kind of like a cross between like a think tank and a daily blog, because it's not just like these sort of like recommendations from on high, like schlub like me can go on there and sort of at least get a sense of like what's being thought about over there. And what I really liked about your story is that you don't seem like you've ever sort of drifted back into a management role. Like you are excited about research up to and including today. So I wanted to talk to you about how you founded this organization and what the original impetus was for it, and what problems you were trying to solve with its creation.
Well, I actually did drift back into a management role
Okay.
After I left Gartner. My intention was to go ahead and start up my own research firm around risk management and compliance and around legal IT. But I needed to do something while I was still under a non-compete. So I went to work for Metric Stream, which was a GRC firm, and ended up spending 4 years there instead of just 1 or 2 like I intended. And I was sort of the chief evangelist, not really a management role. But then within 6 months, the marketing left and marketing fell in my lap. And so I managed the marketing team for the next 3.5 years until I left. I had a great time doing it. It was something new. Really enjoyed it. Had a great bunch of people. It was kind of difficult in that most of them were in India, and I was on the East Coast, and the company was headquartered on the West Coast. So
a lot of late hours.
Yeah, a lot of time zones to juggle.
Yeah.
But I did enjoy it. Now, what led to the Analyst Syndicate is I'd always had this idea of founding my own sort of independent research practice around my areas of specialization. And then I was talking to a couple of other former Gartner colleagues who had left recently, and they had had sort of the same idea. And we decided, well, why don't we put together this thing, sort of a consortium of analysts, of independent analysts? And so the three of us founded the Analyst Syndicate, and as the managing partners. And then we found it was very easy to recruit. Number of we're at about 30 independent analysts who mostly former Gartner. We have some from other places, but and what all the analysts seem to find a value is this this community. Now we're
Yes.
also out doing what I would say is more of a cross between and being an analyst and a consultant. And
Okay.
that we'll go in and work with either an IT executive or work with a vendor on projects that they see a value, and we go in a lot deeper. So each analyst, instead of managing talking to 500 to 1,000 clients a year, is managing relationships with 5 or 6, maybe up to a dozen clients a year. So you're a strategic advisor, and we do a lot of hands-on work as well. So we got our hands dirtier than we did at Gartner.
Okay.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Now, so what is your workday like with the Analyst Syndicate? Our listeners always want to know what job roles look like on a day-to-day or even an hour-by-hour basis. So it sounds like you still do a lot of research, but do you spend your days with clients or other writers or setting policy, or do you still mostly just have your face in a book?
Well, definitely don't have my face in a book most of the time, but I would say I spend a couple hours each day reading.
Hmm.
I do still spend time getting vendor briefings. Any vendor who really wants to brief members of the syndicate can brief members of the syndicate. You don't have to be a client. Um, I spend also time writing, not as much as I would like to,
Hmm.
but we do spend time writing. I work, and being one of the managing partners and being CFO, I have a number of administrative functions I have to do. And I'm still doing work as an independent analyst, working with clients on a regular basis. I've helping them with their analyst strategies, with their go-to-market strategies, and with their product strategies.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's very busy, very
Yeah.
busy.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's gratifying to hear that. So what are, in terms of like what you're actively researching, is it for like a project you're planning on working on, or do you have certain sort of stories or beats that you just kind of follow them just because you're interested in what's going to happen next?
Well, I'm actually working on a book for GRC, on GRC, governance,
Oh,
risk,
yeah.
and compliance.
Right.
So that's something I'm working on. I'm also have another book out there that's really, looking at expanding my dissertation from my doctoral program, which was called Tweeting Dystopia: The Impact of Cyber Mediaries on the Making of Public Policy. So
Okay.
how has social media sort of disintermediated the regulators and the
Mm,
legislators, and people are making public policy directly with direct interaction with industry and with companies these days. So um, these are topics that really interest me.
yeah.
And the risk management aspect of what I'm doing and the compliance aspect are where I overlap into the cybersecurity community quite a bit.
Yeah. Now the social media, tweeting dystopia, as you say, is that what are you expanding on based on what your original dissertation is? Where are you taking it from there? You said you're trying to turn it into a
Yeah.
book.
So the original dissertation was I was curious about how is disruptive technology actually changing how public policy is made? There's a lot of people who have looked at how technology and public policy interact, but I was curious as to how does disruptive technology actually disrupt? How does it disrupt society?
Right.
And so on like that. And in fact, I basically came to a definition of disruptive technology that is really, if it doesn't, it's not disruptive unless you actually are changing how society operates. All right.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of technology that vendors claim is disruptive, but really, does it really change our lives that quickly?
That's becoming a bit of a catchphrase at this point rather than an actual phenomenon.
That's exactly. There's a certain a comedy show about Silicon Valley, right?
Oh yeah, there you go.
The conference called Disrupt every year, so the Disrupt
Right.
conference. So, but I really think it's not truly disruptive unless you disrupt, how society itself is organized or works and so on.
Yeah. Are there any particular sort of disruptive trends that you see sort of coming down the pipe that people should be sort of preparing themselves for in that regard?
Well, I think that when you look at this thing combined with social media has terrifically disrupted how we operate as a society, and it's still doing so. Now, if you look at all kinds of new technologies, I would say potentially the most disruptive thing that we face on the horizon is certainly biotech and genetic engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And that could seriously change, could cause very serious disruptions. And what does it mean to be human? I think one of the books I'd like to write, and this would be a nice little short one, 50 pages or so, is like how to stay employed in your robot future. You either work for the robots,
right,
or you can actually have the robots work for you. Maybe you're a truck driver, and instead of driving the truck, you get couple of automated trucks, right? Autonomous vehicles, and you own those, or you have the option of becoming one. You can become a cyborg yourself and just compete directly with robots. So there's a future for all of us there.
Right. Yeah. That's always interesting to me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But I don't think that most of what we look at from robotics is actually seriously disrupted. It's not disruptive if it occurs over a long period of time. In other words, we can adjust to it.
Yes.
And so we evolve with the technology. Where things get disruptive is when all of a sudden some genius comes up and he says, I can compare faces of women to faces of cows or whatever, and you create a new social media that begins to get a life of its own. And then not only that, we can take it where we go, anywhere we go, and even sleep with it. And that becomes pretty disruptive.
I would imagine things like deep fakes as well, where it's happened so quickly and so thoroughly that it's very, very hard to even imagine to sort of like how to sort of vet or fact check or anything like that. Like it's just sort of happened right now.
Yeah, exactly. It is. There's things like that can just sort of pop up overnight, and they become extraordinarily disruptive. And thanks to the fact that most of what we spend time as humans making these days is made with digital putty. These things can just pop up and be very surprising.
Yeah. Now, we want to sort of pivot over to, the work side of cyber work here as well. So, with all the predictions, for the future of security and the things that you're seeing happening, could you give any advice or tips that you would have for students and early professionals in this field who are just getting their feet wet in the cybersecurity work sphere? I mean, are there things that they should be watching out for, as you say, in terms of like disruptive technology or changes or policy changes or anything like that, if you want to be a security researcher, like what would you say to someone who's starting to do that now?
It's totally different than when I started in it, and that there were people came from a lot of different backgrounds, I noticed, into the IT profession and into security, both. And there was no really sort of set background from where you came. Certainly there were computer science majors even back in the day when I was in college, but it wasn't really prevalent. And so as the IT industry grew, people were hired from all kinds of fields. And so I think one of the things, though, that I've noticed I think really helps with cybersecurity professionals is to be able to, I would say, do really good analytical thinking. And along with that, so, really hone your analytical skills. And as a researcher, that's extraordinarily important.
Yeah.
And be able to put yourself outside of your own, uh, I guess, be able to put yourself outside. I don't know how to describe it, but almost outside of your own body, and just look at things from a perspective, be open to looking at things from other perspectives. Now, the only way you can do that is to be part of communities, be
Right.
part of peer communities that cross the boundaries of work, and cross, in other words, if all you're doing is hanging around with the same people all the time, in the same work environment, then you're not really going to be able to do that sort of, almost like I said, put yourself outside of yourself.
Yeah.
And you can't do that. You'll never be able to think outside the box. I also think you can get a lot of, you need to be recognized when you're losing sight of the box. Okay, I see a lot of people in the thought leadership, areas of thought leadership and so on, that are just way so far. They've gotten so far away from practical reality that
Right.
they couldn't find the box if they had to. Okay.
Yeah.
If they were running out of oxygen out wherever they are, and all the oxygen's in the box, they would
Deep
die.
space. Yeah.
They would
Right.
die. Okay.
Yeah.
They couldn't get back inside that box if they had to. So you need to recognize, be careful.
And you can't be, you can't be living in a simulator the entire, you can't sit there. Well, with all of these things being ideal, then this will definitely work, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now you have to deal with the practical realities. And I think but once again, it's that connection with other people in your field, but also people outside your field, other people in your workplace, but also people outside your workplace.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's helped me a lot is just staying in touch with people that I used to work with, okay, or that I used to go to school with, because they may have been doing what you may have all been doing the same thing at one time, but everybody diverges a little. So if you can just stay in touch and build this sort of alumni community around you, then I think it's important. Just don't lose touch with those great people that you've worked with over time, because you'll learn from them too.
Yeah, they're all learning at the same time that you're learning, so they might have different advice for you now than they did 20 years ago.
They certainly should. If not, there's something wrong.
then you need to educate them or something.
They may still be in the basement, smoking the dope.
Floating away from the box again.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to go back to Digital Pearl Harbor a little bit. Our company just launched a collaboration with ChooseCo to create a Choose Your Own Adventure themed security awareness training program, which, is very appealing to people in their 30s and 40s or younger or whatever. But I wanted to ask about this simulator that you did. Was this aimed at simply finding like what the result would be, or was there an education component? And if the latter, can you talk about the role of gameplay and strengthening retention of knowledge in these kind of situations?
Yeah, I mean, it was really fascinating. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
still kind of awed, at
Mhm.
what happened there. I was
Yeah.
gonna say what we did, but I don't think I'd really describe. It's what happened. We brought in, and we had, people that, like I said, are living the day-to-day world of managing information systems, managing security, and then subject matter experts that they brought with them. And we had all kinds of companies there. From banks to we had banks, we had Cisco, we had all
Right.
kinds of different companies there. And what we did is for the year prior to that, we designed the game.
Mm,
We didn't spend a year doing it, obviously. It wasn't,
right.
but I mean, we would have meetings down then with the War College and with those of us at Gartner who were involved in this, and we narrowed it down to four areas of critical infrastructure that we were going to game. And one was the financial services sector. Another was the telecom, and then the other was there was the grid, and then there was the actual backbone of the internet itself. Okay,
Hmm.
it kind of distinct from telecom. And so we were when we once we had the game kind of designed, we brought everybody together, and we had pretty much just two teams. Typically, you have three teams. You have uh, the blue team, or the good guys,
Right.
okay. The red team, the bad guys, and then the
Yep.
white team, which is the command and control. Controlling the game
Right.
essentially. So they're not really players; they're
Yeah.
observers.
Okay.
Um, so we just did a red team and a white team because we had no blue team. We had
Yeah.
we had no idea what is the blue team supposed to do. We don't
Yeah.
even know
You're
what
learning to build a blue team by playing the game in this case, it sounds like.
exactly. What we
Yeah.
did is the question we were trying to answer is, could we create a a scenario for a strategic cyber attack? We didn't go
Right.
in with a scenario even. We had no idea. We just said, here are the four industries. Here's what we think a strategic cyber attack would look like. We basically modeled it on the Quebec ice storm of a couple of
Mm.
decades ago,
Hmm.
and said, it took out Quebec for 6 weeks. Could we do that with a cyber attack?
Right.
And then we ran the game, and everybody got to play sort of terrorist or bad guy. And we had those four teams that were, well, we essentially had four teams, and those four teams would be given a challenge by the white team. Um, they would send observers to the other three infrastructure areas, so it was all coordinated. And then we'd have a period of time where they did physically come together to coordinate, and then they'd read out that part of the war game. So we went through all the phases of an attack, from the design, the planning and design to the execution, and came up with this. Now, how do we let the world know? This was done at the Naval War College, so we're and it's sponsored by the White House. And so the War College, actually, we at Gartner, we wrote up the results as best we could, and the Naval War College sent it to the War College for a security review, and they reviewed it, and very few changes were actually made.
Yeah.
And so then we published it, and I wish I could tell the story about this one government organization that pulled us on the carpet and said that our scenario could not possibly happen. And
Hmm.
Richard Hunter, who was my co-director, he and I got raked across the carpet for a couple hours while they chewed us out and talked about
Wow.
how they were going to pull their Gartner contracts and so on like that. We didn't care. We're analysts,
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then a couple months later, we found out that one of the senior board members of this particular government organization had triggered this raking of over the coals. And it turns out that he was never told by this organization that they had run a similar war game just on the particular sector, financial services sector, and had come up with a very similar result.
Oh, interesting.
And it had never been brought up to the senior executives and board of this organization.
So it was already just sort of gathering dust somewhere at that point.
Yeah, and here we published it all out there, and I credit a lot of changes to that. So, for instance, at the time, you could go to King County, Washington, and find out all the kinds of information around pipelines, natural gas pipelines, electrical lines, all kinds of stuff was just publicly available. And at the time, remember the early 2000s, government organizations and even private, commercial organizations were putting all kinds of sensitive information on the internet. But just because they could.
Yeah.
And so you lost what's in legal terminology called practical obscurity.
Yes.
In other words, with practical obscurity, it may be publicly available information, but I have to go through some steps to get to it.
Yep.
Yep. I have to reveal who I am. I have to go into the county courthouse.
Right.
Things like that. So that made it harder to get to this, what today is thought of as very sensitive information, is much harder to get. But people were starting to put it right out on the web.
Yeah, well, I want to wrap up today. We're coming up to about an hour, and I want to be able to not take up too much more of your time. This has been absolutely fascinating, and we could talk for hours. But I want to sort of tie this up with the sort of war, cybercrime, cyberterrorism situation with previous episodes we've had. We talked to Emily Miller of Mocana, who is all about infrastructure security, and she's covered the water supply hack in Florida, and all sorts of legacy systems that are out of date in sort of municipal systems, and then also last week I spoke with Dirk Schrader of NewNet Technologies about legacy systems in healthcare, and he said that there are a literal 1 million plus pieces of medical data, including x-rays and 3D scans, open to the world that you could add or subtract cancer from, or change a diagnosis. And so we get these stories where it's like there's all this openness, and as you said, you need to know the ability to sort of like what to surround, what your perimeter is of your data and your information and so forth. And what are you, and then you talked about the digital Pearl Harbor and saying, well, that could never happen. So like, as a way of wrapping up, like, first of all, how possible do you think these kinds of attacks are? And two, if they are really possible, how do we intensify the message so that people start to realize that there's just this sort of like acres and acres of wide open sensitive data out there that is just sort of waiting to be attacked, especially in a coordinated way?
Well, I think there's all kinds of nuisance attacks, and then thanks to the way information is shared so rapidly and easily these days, these have a much bigger impact than they did, say, in 2002. The social amplification of risk is what I call that. As, what may seem to be relatively insignificant risk to an expert, to people who are out in the rest of the world, seems to be an extraordinarily big issue. So you magnify the risk many times over with social amplification. So I think these nuisance attacks, what I would consider a nuisance attack, even the hack, the hack of the water supply controls there in Florida, well, that's a nuisance attack. Taking down a good part of the grid for 24 hours would frankly be a nuisance attack. It's not going to change the balance of power. It's going to be awfully inconveniencing. Ransomware attacks, where we've seen that hospitals have even delayed surgeries and so on.
Yep.
These on the scale, on a national security scale, are nuisance attacks. Now, take all of that and do it all at one time and actually cause some damage. Now, that would be potentially strategic. And what we found, I think this Digital Pearl Harbor, and this still holds true, is that a combination of a physical attack and a cyber attack has a much greater effect than either one by itself. Okay. So say you're doing some cyber attacks on the grid, but you also blow up a couple of those 250,000 volt substations, of which there are only 3 spares at any given moment in the United States. That physical attack combined with the cyber attack I would say that becomes closer to a strategic attack.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So, I think on that note, I think we're to wrap things up today. For the final question here, if our listeners want to learn more about French Caldwell or the Analyst Syndicate, where should they go online?
Well, you can look at my LinkedIn profile, and you can also go to the Analyst Syndicate, which is, you can just type in the analystsyndicate.com or analystsyndicate.com, or our primary URL, which is Thansyn, THANSYN.com. All right.
Okay. Yeah. And what will they find? Like, I know, like you said, that there's the sort of high level sort of stuff, but is this something that just regular schmoes like me can look in there and derive value from?
Right now, well, unlike the larger research firms, everything our analysts writes is publicly available. So you can just go in, you'll find the blog, you'll be able to go in there. You can search on my name or search for Richard Steenan, for instance, who used to write for Forbes, is now publishing a lot of his commentary with us. And so you can search for any analyst or any topic and see what our thoughts are on it, what our insights are.
Now, I think go ahead.
So we've tried to put the thought leadership out front, but I think one of the things that we're doing now is we're definitely defining better, kind of the services that we can offer to both the technology providers and the technology users.
Great. And I think that's a really great place for, our students and new professionals. Go check out the Analyst Syndicate and get up to date with what people are thinking about in the industry. Right now, you're probably just thinking about how to get into it, but get a sense of what people are doing on the front lines right now. I think it's a really good place to start. Yeah. So again, thank you.
By the way, I just want to say I've never turned down an inquiry from a student. Okay.
Oh, so there you have it.
You don't have to pay. And I don't think any of our analysts would ever turn that down. We support, people who are studying and researching just about any area of the field.
You heard it here first, folks. Go talk to French. He is available. All right. Well, thank you again, French. And I really appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
And as always, thank you to everyone listening at home or at work today. New episodes of the Cyberwork podcast are available every Monday at 1 p.m. Central, both on video on our YouTube page and on audio wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. And as always, don't forget to check out our hands-on training series, Cyberwork Applied. Tune in as expert Infosec instructors teach you a new cybersecurity skill and show you how that skill applies to real-world scenarios. Go to infosecinstitute.com/learn to stay up to date on all things cyberwork. Thank you once again to French Caldwell, and thank you all again for watching and listening this week. We will speak to you next week.